Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for today's webinar here at Spectrum Labs. My name is Heddle. I am the social media manager and apparently now the webinar host here at Spectrum Labs. Today we'll be tackling the topic of illegal gun sales that are happening online. And it's not just in the dark corners of the web and the dark web and things you need all sorts of special browsers to access. It's happening in plain sight on places like Facebook, Snapchat, and eBay. Somebody who's a little bit more better studied on this topic than I am is Matt Schroeder of Small Arms Survey. He's a senior researcher there. Matt, thank you for joining us, and let's kick things off right now. Can you share your background and give us an overview of what you do at Small Arms Survey?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. I am a senior researcher at Small Arms Survey. I've been a senior researcher there since 2014, and my particular area of focus at the survey is the illicit arms trade.
So what problem would you say that Small Arms Survey is trying to solve specifically? What are like the real life consequences here? How does what you do, how does that affect our day-to-day life?
Yeah, the consequences of the illicit arms trade and arms trafficking are manifold and ubiquitous. Small arms and light weapons are the weapons of choice for most types of violent non-state actors, from drug traffickers in Mexico to state-sponsored proxy groups in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East to street gangs in Chicago. So the nature and extent of the problem varies often significantly from country to country, but every country, every part of the world is negatively affected by the illicit acquisition and use of small arms and light weapons.
It's definitely all connected. Do you have any, in your day-to-day work, do you have any eye-opening stats on illegal proliferation of weapons that you could share with us to illustrate exactly how bad of a problem it is?
Yeah, that is a very good question, and one that I get a lot. And unfortunately, we don't have a satisfactory answer. And the reason is because of the data. The data, there are a lot of gaps in the data. There's a lot of ambiguities in the data. And these gaps and ambiguities preclude the development of those types of statistics. I've seen many different statistics, many different estimates for the global illicit arms trade. But frankly, I don't trust any of them because I have worked closely with the data, lots of different data sets. I popped the hood of those data sets and I've had a look at them, and all of them are lacking. And that's to say that we don't have good data on trafficking and the mechanics of trafficking, but the estimates, the global estimates, the estimates of dollar values, we don't know if the data that we have is representative of the total population of the data in ways that allow for that type of extrapolation. So I hate to disappoint, also don't want to misinform. So I'm not going to offer up any of those types of statistics.
Gotcha. Yeah, the data that I've seen it's alarming, but it's also, as you said, probably incomplete. For example, in the last 6 months, Facebook says that they've removed 4.8 million posts related to gun sales, which are banned on the platform. And Facebook in general also, they claim that their algorithm catches 93% of gun sales before they're even reported by users. So segueing from that, I'd like to ask you, Matt, again, could you shed some light on how people are actually kind of manipulating social media to sell weapons?
Oh, certainly. And I should note that that type of data, there's no reason to doubt the veracity or the utility of that type of data. What I was referring to are the global estimates. Sometimes you'll see $1 billion a year. And those are the types of estimates that I view with some skepticism.
Right.
So regarding how people are using social media and the internet to sell weapons, before I answer that question, I probably should note the context in which I've studied online arms trafficking. So in recent years, I've done 2 studies in which online arms trafficking was a prominent feature. The first study was on the illicit acquisition and use of small arms and light weapons in Ukraine, which unfortunately has not been published yet, so I can't share the findings from that one, but it will be published soon, and the results of that study will be available on our website. The second study, which is very relevant to today's discussion, is an in-depth analysis of the mechanics of international arms trafficking by criminal networks in the United States, which we published in 2016. And then we've continued to update that data set and monitor the problem since then. So that study revealed that traffickers use the internet in numerous ways, just like everybody else. They're plugged in, and it's as much a part of their lives as anybody else's. But there are two areas of online activity that are perhaps most impactful, most notable. And the first is advertising and outreach. In other words, identifying and communicating with potential buyers. And the second is procurement. It's the acquisition of weapons, ammunition, parts, and accessories by traffickers with the intent to illicitly retransfer these items to unauthorized end users. And in the case of our study, these unauthorized end users were located overseas. Now, I don't want to overstate the problem, so I should note that the internet did not play a significant role in all of the trafficking that we studied. Some of the traffickers, some of the trafficking networks, including many of the traffickers working for the cartels in Mexico, did not need to advertise or conduct outreach. They had a very specific and very powerful and wealthy client already in mind. And interestingly, most of the weapons obtained by these traffickers, or at least the traffickers that we studied, appear to have been purchased from brick and mortar stores rather than online. But in other cases, the internet, and especially online marketplaces, played a huge role in the trafficking operations. One could argue an indispensable role. And some of the networks that in which the online marketplaces were key were among the most prolific and geographically expansive of the trafficking networks that we studied. And a good example is a network that was operating out of Washington, California, and Thailand that was run by two brothers. One of the brothers, the one that was based in Washington, would take orders from the brother based in Thailand for different firearms parts and accessories. The Washington-based brother would then go online and, with co-conspiracies that he had recruited for this network, would order the parts online. And they'd receive the parts, they'd take them out of the packaging, get rid of any sign that the parts were associated with weapons. So they'd remove labels, they'd take instruction manuals out, then they would repackage them, oftentimes in nothing more extensive than a padded envelope. They'd go to the local post office and they'd send them off. Simple. And that's about it. They did take steps to minimize scrutiny, but those steps were usually not overly sophisticated. They falsely labeled the items, the commodities that they were sending on documentation, as something more innocuous. They'd undervalue them to minimize scrutiny. They'd use false names and false addresses, and sometimes they'd mix up the location of the post office that they'd send to so that the staff didn't become too familiar with them. But it was all pretty basic stuff, and it worked for years. Authorities estimate that the network arranged at least 240 shipments of firearms parts to Thailand from 2010 to 2013, the estimated value of which was more than $1 million. And most of this, or all of this, it's not clear, were procured online.
There was a similar case that has a lot of parallels to what you just described. It was out of the Bay Area, actually, where California has strict gun laws, but for example, Nevada, the neighboring state, one state over, does not. And there was a guy, I believe he was also running it with his brother, but I don't think it was the same case that you're talking about. But he was using Snapchat to sell guns that he would buy in mass from Nevada, and he would bring them over. And I didn't see what his total income or whatever off of it was, but the ATF agents that busted him ended up paying him something like $35,000 over the course of a year for, I think it was 30 firearms, to buy 30 firearms undercover. And if that was just from one undercover agent, this guy was constantly posting on Snapchat about guns that his followers could buy or whatever. It seems like they only hit the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. And we've seen similar cases and cases of even greater magnitude, actually, in regards to overseas buyers. And then they also use marketplaces, these online marketplaces, not to procure weapons, but to identify and interact with potential clients. And I think one really interesting case in that regard was a trafficking network based in Tennessee that was purchasing stolen military equipment from soldiers at a local military base and then selling that equipment, usually one item at a time, on eBay. And through this approach, they shipped more than 1,600 of the items to overseas buyers in at least 16 countries on 4 continents over the course of 3 years. So eBay took steps to suspend the account, but the traffickers, all they did was just set up alternative accounts and start to describe the weapons in a way that attracted less scrutiny. So, and I think particularly in that case, it illustrates one of the huge advantages of trafficking in the internet age. Before the internet, if this particular trafficking network were operating before the internet, I cannot imagine that they would have a client base that it extended beyond their hometown. These guys were not Victor Boot. They were not globe-trotting arms traffickers. These were locals, but because of the interconnectivity of the internet age, suddenly they have a potential client base that literally spans the world.
Right, and we've seen platforms take measures to prevent this, but as we've seen, banning stuff on the internet is not always effective. Just for example, Facebook has banned all firearm sales since 2014. eBay enacted a ban against gun and ammo sales way back in 2002, but they did quietly lift part of that in 2015 by allowing the sale of gun parts, not entire guns, but like specific gun parts. Do you think eBay is doing enough?
Well, I would phrase it this way. I think that efforts by companies like eBay and Facebook to detect and thwart illegal activity on their websites or among their communities, it's laudable and it's important. But it's not sufficient, probably will never be sufficient. This is a multifaceted problem that requires a multifaceted solution. And a multifaceted approach includes efforts like the ones engaged in by some of the more responsible social media sites, but also robust laws and regulations and resources and authorities to enforce those laws and regulations, rigorous import and export controls, because this trade is global. You have to treat it as such. And along those lines also, you need effective border security and customs. And then here's a control strategy that many of your listeners may not be aware of. There's several governments and international institutions have conventional weapons threat mitigation programs that seek to right-size and secure arsenals in different countries. And this is important because it's not just in the United States where these platforms are being used. There is, the survey has documented online arms sales in places like Libya. New York Times has documented it in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. It's a global phenomenon. And one of the most worrisome sources of weapons are excess stockpiles accumulated by governments, often over decades, that contain a lot of weapons that the governments will never need, but for whatever reason, they're holding on to them. Either they think that destruction, right-sizing arsenals will be too costly or bureaucratically difficult, or they think that these weapons have resale value. Regardless, they're a threat. They're a threat in the short term because these arsenals are often vulnerable to diversion, and then in the long term, because when there's extreme political instability in these countries with these arsenals, sometimes these arsenals get looted, and then overnight you have the influx of massive quantities of weapons. And it can change the profile of illicit weapons in a country and even in a region within days. And the consequences of that we're still dealing with in Libya. And remnants of those looted arsenals are turning up online in closed Facebook groups, and it extends way beyond just firearms parts and accessories. They posted for sale anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and even complete shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. So huge threat. Another approach that's required is good relations between vendors, online vendors and brick and mortar vendors, and authorities, both law enforcement and the folks at Facebook and elsewhere that are attempting to control these sales. In many of the cases that we studied, it was the vendor that tipped off authorities about illicit activity. either prompting the investigation or providing the evidence necessary to convict the traffickers and dismantle the networks. The vendors are extremely valuable sources of intelligence, and their cooperation is essential. And so it's important to build trust and lines of communication with the vendors. And then finally, training for postal employees, training for moderators of online platforms, training for AI that is used to detect illicit activity, and anybody else that is on the front lines of this problem.
You certainly said the magic word there, AI, which will summon Spectrum Labs CEO Justin into the conversation here. We've been watching, various abusive behaviors and illegal behaviors that happen on online platforms. And with regards to weapon sales, we can see that it's an online problem that ends up having very real world offline consequences. So Justin, from your perspective and from, your digital first approach to your industry, how is this a problem, or why is this a problem? I should say, we already know how, but why is this exactly a problem for online marketplaces in terms of catching illegal weapons and catching all the loopholes that sellers try to enact in order to continue the illegal arms trade online?
Yeah. So to your question, Hedl, that question speaks to the heart of actually why we started Spectrum to begin with, which was, a little around 3 years ago, we did some research and found out that a lot of the ways that social media companies, dating apps, marketplaces, gaming platforms, and so forth, the way that they were doing and thinking about content moderation for detecting specific behaviors was really keyword driven or simple classifier driven, meaning they were looking at a single sentence or a sentence or two to try and catch a specific behavior. And as you would suspect for something like trafficking or munition stealing, that's not sufficient enough. You're going to miss a lot of the cases of actual arms dealing and trafficking of weapons. You're also going to flood the moderation queue with a bunch of false positives, right? You're going to use a keyword for specific types of guns, for brands, for different parts, for different accessories. And for someone like a gaming company where, kids are being groomed into these types of behaviors for buying and selling all sorts of stuff online, that can be problematic because they may be talking about specific toy guns or Nerf guns or guns within the game itself that have nothing to do with that. That just wastes the moderator's time. And so when we set out to start Spectrum a few years ago, we wanted to really focus on the data side, which is what I liked about what Matt said in the beginning. We really wanted to focus on the data side of the entire workflow for a trust and safety team to really focus on the way that we could improve how companies think about detecting a really complex behavior or piece of content like the trafficking of specific parts and weapons.
In the most blunt terms possible, why can't the eBays of the world and why can't the the Facebooks of the world completely eliminate this problem?
Yeah, I think any social platform has definitely made some strides, at least over the last 2 or 3 years, to improve the systems that they use to detect complex behaviors, whether that's cyberbullying, harassment, self-harm, or something like more complex like human trafficking or the trafficking of weapons. I think largely the reason why companies like eBay or maybe Etsy or something like that would struggle or continues to struggle on being much more accurate at this is kind of what Matt was talking about earlier around data, but a much different lens onto the data problem. There's just a lack of high quality labeled data that can characterize not just a single message between two users talking about and identifying that there's an actual case of weapons being sold on that platform, but there's a lack of data for the entire journey of the buyer and the seller and how they get to the point of that transaction itself. Meaning, how does the buyer go about finding that person and then grooming them on various platforms across something like Snapchat and then into eBay? Where does the transaction happen? Where does the conversation happen? And that's a data problem. For eBay specifically, just taking that example, they don't necessarily have a lens into all the places that their users off platform are having conversations. And so they're limited to the inputs and outputs that their platform gives a buyer and seller of any type. And so that means they're limited to items and the descriptions and historical behaviors of the buyer and seller, ratings, lifetime value, that sort of thing. And that makes it really challenging. I think that a lot of these platforms have improved. That's why they're not catching nothing. right? They are catching stuff, but there's an opportunity for all of them to improve, whether that's better account verification on the front end, which is in the realm of trust and safety, but isn't necessarily what Spectrum does, or it's improving their models, the way that the AI looks at a string of behaviors and content and tries to make a determination on, is this thing a safe transaction, or is this something that's problematic? And if it's problematic, can a machine make a decision around if that's allowed, or does it need to go to some human that then can read through it? What's I think obvious, or is becoming more apparent, is throwing more and more people at the problem won't scale. And nor should people be exposed to that type of content, not just munitions dealing online, but all sorts of other abusive behaviors that moderators get exposed to from a digital wellness perspective. That's just not a healthy thing. But most importantly, it doesn't scale. So investments are being made on trust and safety. I think even folks like the Airbnbs of the world who deal in marketplaces, but are bridging people to come together. They think about trust and safety as well. So you're seeing over the last, let's say, 2 years or so, a massive increase in investment from not just marketplaces, but dating apps, gaming companies, social platforms, to do a much better job of investing on the data side that's required in order to build out the right algorithms that can help them more properly detect stuff. But that doesn't happen overnight.
So I should probably know this since I work at Spectrum Labs, but I do not. And it might actually be beneficial that I don't, because then I can be more inquisitive about it. What exactly are you doing to solve this problem, Justin? What exactly is Spectrum Labs doing to help combat this problem?
Yeah, we can't be everything to everyone as much as we would like to be. I would love to go in and solve many different problems related to trust and safety for each of these social platforms. But really where we focus on and do a really good job is looking at the entire workflow of how a behavior is detected and then responded to in the content moderation workflow. And really where we excel is honing in on that detection side. So building out a library of specific behaviors that we have proprietary models that we've built and deployed to each customer so they can detect things like self-harm or hate speech or cyberbullying. For the purposes of this webinar, things like selling and trafficking of different parts and accessories related to weapons. But yeah, we go in and help their data science and content moderation teams by providing them with a much more robust data collection and behavior detection system that they currently just don't have. And mainly the reason that we're able to do that is because we've spent a few years now working with many different customers, as well as NGOs and researchers like Matt or the Small Arms Survey, to acquire specific data sets that aren't just proprietary to us, but also leverage the best-in-class data sets that are available and try and bring them into a centralized proprietary data repository that we can then use to democratize the access to the models that then each client can use to fit to their own needs and specifications within their own social platform. So really it's all about how do we help social platforms do a much better job of detecting the really nasty stuff that's happening on their site by giving them a tool set and a data set that goes above and beyond simple classification, simple classifiers, or even keyword-based detection systems that they may have built.
So Matt, bringing it back to you for a second, Justin mentioned data sets and things like that, and I've seen the Small Arms Survey, even though you said at the beginning of this podcast that, or this webinar, sorry, I called it a podcast. You said at the beginning earlier today that it's really hard to collect comprehensive data. Nevertheless, I've seen Small Arms Survey's site. I've seen your guys' study. You do collect quite a bit of data. So how exactly do you go about collecting that data, and who ultimately ends up using that data to combat the same problem that we're all talking about right now?
So I should probably clarify again that there is a lot of data. In fact, there's more data than we can possibly analyze, which is a happy problem. But it is an issue that we need to address. And so my point was just that data does not lend itself to aggregate overall figures, but it does lend itself very nicely to the tracking of illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and analyzing the mechanics of those transfers. And in that regard, we try to diversify our data as much as possible. And so we engage in field research when appropriate. We collect data from social media. Social media is a huge and increasingly important source of data, especially in regions of the world where other types of data are not available. But social media data can be often very difficult to verify. And so we corroborate that data whenever possible with data from government sources, data obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. So many different sources of data, many different types of data. And one of the big challenges is figuring out how to drink from the fire hose, how to search through and identify relevant information in the flood of data that is constantly streaming across the internet every day.
What would you say is a notable success that Small Arms Survey has had recently? Something that we can all relate to.
Well, I think we define success maybe a little bit differently from other organizations, since our output is data and information and good information. I think that we've produced many studies and compiled data sets that I'm very proud of and that have directly informed policymakers. I can't go into the details of how because of certain client privileges, but yeah, the kind of the melding of expertise developed over 2 decades with the new opportunities presented by social media have led to some breakthroughs that have really increased our understanding and our ability to convey effectively information about illicit arms trafficking.
Gotcha. So how can our listeners support Small Arms Survey and help continue these breakthroughs?
Yeah, well, check us out. We have a website that contains all of our most of our publications. We have a Facebook account and we have a Twitter account at Small Arms Survey.
Sounds good. We'll be sure to do that. All right, Matt, thank you for joining us. It's been about a half an hour of your time. I hope we didn't take away too much time from you to help save the world out there, but it was definitely a pleasure to have you.
It was a pleasure to participate. Thanks very much.